Tonight, I want to take you somewhere unusual, not to the grand academies of Athens or the sunlit colonnades of Rome, but to a hillside above the ancient city of Ephesus on the western coast of what is now Turkey. The year is somewhere around 500 BCE, and below us, one of the wealthiest ports in the known world hums with trade and worship and politics. Ships crowd the harbor, merchants haggle in a dozen languages, and towering above it all, the temple of Artemis, that colossal wonder of the ancient world, rises in white marble against the Ionian sky, its forest of columns catching the last light of the afternoon sun. But the man we have come to meet is not down there. He is up here, alone, watching it all with something between contempt and sorrow in his eyes. He was born into one of the most powerful families in the city. He held a hereditary title that some sources translate as king, and he gave it away. He walked away from power, from politics, from the respect of his fellow citizens. He told the people of Ephesus they were no better than animals. He mocked the greatest poets and thinkers of his age. He preferred playing dice with children in the temple courtyard to governing a city. And then, in the solitude he chose, he sat down and wrote a single book so bewildering, so deliberately obscure, that even in his own lifetime people called him the Dark One. His name was Heraclitus, and the ideas he placed on papyrus and left inside that gleaming temple 2,500 years ago would go on to reshape everything we think about change, identity, and the nature of reality itself. Here is what makes tonight's journey different from the stories of most philosophers. We do not have his book. It was lost to time, probably destroyed centuries after he wrote it. What we have instead are fragments, over 100 brief quotations preserved like amber fossils inside the writings of later thinkers who grappled with his words across 700 years. And these fragments are not gentle. They are riddles. They are provocations. They are sentences that sound simple on the surface and then open into chasms of meaning the longer you sit with them. You have almost certainly heard the most famous one, even if you did not know where it came from. No man ever steps in the same river twice. It sounds like a pleasant observation about nature, but Heraclitus meant something far more unsettling. He was not just talking about rivers. He was talking about you. He was saying that the person who stepped into the river the first time no longer exists by the time they step in again. You are not a fixed point. You are a process. You are not a thing. You are a happening. And if that thought sends a small tremor through your sense of who you are, then Heraclitus would say you are finally beginning to wake up. Tonight we will trace the full arc of his life and thought. We will walk the streets of ancient Ephesus and feel the tension of a Greek city living under Persian rule. We will unpack his philosophy of fire and flux and the hidden pattern he called the logos that holds the chaos together. We will wrestle with his belief that war and opposition are not enemies of harmony, but the very things that create it. And we will confront the deeply personal question his philosophy forces upon each of us. If everything is changing, always, then who exactly are you? But I should warn you, Heraclitus has a way of getting under your skin. His sentences are short enough to remember and deep enough to keep you thinking for years. So, settle in. Let your body find its comfortable position. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, and allow the story of the weeping philosopher to carry you gently into the night. After all, he believed that sleep and waking were two sides of the same coin, and that the boundary between them was thinner than most people ever realize. To understand Heraclitus, you first have to understand the world that shaped him. And that world was Ephesus, a city that in the 6th century before the Common Era was one of the most vibrant, contested, and intellectually alive places on the planet. Ephesus sat at the mouth of the Cayster River on the Ionian coast of Asia Minor. It was a port city, which meant it was a crossroads. Greek culture flowed in from the west. Persian influence pressed from the east. Lydian wealth, before the Persians came, had already left its mark. Traders from Egypt and Phoenicia and the far reaches of the Mediterranean brought not just goods but ideas, stories, cosmologies, ways of seeing the world that mingled in the marketplace like the scent of spices from distant shores. The city's great pride was the temple of Artemis, not the slim huntress of mainland Greek mythology, but the Ephesian Artemis, a mother goddess draped in symbols of fertility and animal power. Her statue strange and ancient and covered in what may have been bull testicles or gourds or some other symbol of life's relentless creative force. The temple itself was staggering. Built with the financial backing of Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia, it was one of the largest structures in the Greek world, constructed entirely of marble with over 100 columns rising into the coastal air. It was not merely a religious site. It served as a bank, a political center, a gathering place, and a repository for the city's most important documents and treasures. This is the temple where Heraclitus would later deposit his book, and this is the city he would later refuse to serve. But before we get to Heraclitus himself, stay a moment longer in the streets of Ephesus, because this city was not merely a backdrop, it was a character in the story. Walk down toward the harbor in the early morning, and you would see the first fishing boats dragging their nets through water still gray with dawn. By the time the sun had cleared the hills, the commercial quays would be loud and dense with activity. Grain from Egypt, timber from the Black Sea coast, textiles dyed in the famous Tyrian purple so costly that a single bolt of cloth was worth more than a skilled laborer's yearly wages. Amphorae of olive oil and wine stacked in rows along the docks, waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for 100 ports. The harbor itself was a problem that would eventually define the city's fate. The Caister River kept silting it up, depositing layers of mud and sand that pushed the shoreline steadily outward. Engineers fought a constant battle to keep the channels navigable. It was a losing battle, one that would eventually force the city to relocate its harbor entirely. But in Heraclitus's time, the water was still deep enough for the heavy-bellied trading vessels to reach the docks. Even this mundane engineering challenge contains a Heraclitean lesson, though the philosopher had not yet been born to notice it. The river that gave the city life was also slowly choking it. Creation and destruction working together. As always, the marketplace would have been a sensory overload, vendors calling out in Ionian Greek, in Lydian, in the guttural sounds of Carian and Lycian, and the clipped consonants of Persian administrative language. Since the fall of Lydia to Cyrus the Great in 546 BCE, Ephesus had been part of the Persian Empire, and the presence of Persian authority colored everything. Tax collectors carrying records on clay tablets, Persian garrison soldiers in their distinctive felt caps, walking through streets that still displayed Greek architectural taste. It was a strange coexistence. The Persians were generally content to let Greek cities manage their own internal affairs, as long as the tribute kept flowing. But the political arrangement created a low hum of resentment among Greek citizens who chafed under foreign oversight. Heraclitus would have grown up with this tension between Greek independence and Persian domination as a constant background noise. It would eventually erupt in the Ionian Revolt of 499 BCE, a catastrophic uprising that Ephesus supported, and that ended in brutal Persian reprisal, including the burning of Miletus, the intellectual capital of Ionia, and the city that had produced Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes. Heraclitus would have been in his mid-30s when Miletus fell, old enough to feel the shock, and perhaps to draw from it one more confirmation that conflict and destruction are woven into the fabric of existence. But the most important feature of Ephesus for our story is not its politics or its commerce, but its position at the intersection of traditions. This was a place where ideas collided. Greek rationalism met Eastern mysticism. The mathematical precision of Pythagorean thought circulated alongside the ecstatic religious practices of the Artemis cult. Merchants who had traveled to Babylon brought back astronomical observations and mathematical techniques that Greek thinkers adapted and transformed. Ephesus was, in the language of modern complexity theory, an edge environment, a place where different systems overlap and novel patterns emerge from the friction between them. It was exactly the right place to produce a philosopher obsessed with the creative power of opposition. He was born around 535 BCE into an aristocratic family. His father's name was Blosson, though some ancient sources give it as Heracon. The family held a hereditary position in Ephesus that carried the title of Basilius, which translates roughly as king, though the role was likely more ceremonial than political by Heraclitus's time. It may have involved presiding over certain religious rites, particularly those connected to the Eleusinian mysteries or the city's sacred traditions. What Heraclitus did with this inheritance is one of the first clues to his character. He gave it away. According to Diogenes Laertius, our main ancient source for the lives of Greek philosophers, Heraclitus ceded his hereditary title to his younger brother. The reasons are not entirely clear, but the gesture speaks volumes. Here was a man who looked at the mechanisms of social power, the titles and ceremonies, and political maneuvering that defined public life in a Greek city, and decided that none of it was worth his attention. He had something else in mind. The intellectual world Heraclitus inhabited was already rich with philosophical ambition. Just down the coast in Miletus, a series of brilliant thinkers had been asking one of the most fundamental questions a human mind can pose. What is everything made of? What is the underlying substance, the arche, from which all of reality emerges? Thales, the first of the Milesian philosophers, had proposed water. There was an elegant logic to this. Water could be solid, liquid, or gas. It fell from the sky and rose from the earth. It seemed to be everywhere and in everything. Anaximander, his student, pushed the idea further and proposed something more abstract, the apeiron, a boundless, indefinite creative energy from which all definite things emerge. Anaximenes, the third of the great Milesians, settled on air, arguing that through processes of condensation and rarefaction, air could become fire, wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. Heraclitus knew these ideas. He lived just a short distance from Miletus, and the philosophical conversations of the Ionian coast were unavoidable for anyone with an active mind. But he was not impressed. In fact, he was contemptuous of nearly everyone. He dismissed Homer and Hesiod, the pillars of Greek literary tradition. He mocked Pythagoras, calling his learning a kind of elaborate fraud. He criticized Xenophanes and Hecataeus. Much learning does not teach understanding, he wrote. And in that single line, you can hear the frustration of a man who believed that accumulating facts without grasping their deeper pattern was worse than useless. When the people of Ephesus, recognizing his brilliance despite his difficult personality, asked him to write laws for the city, he refused. According to the ancient accounts, he told them the city's government was already so corrupt that it was beyond saving. Instead, he went to the temple of Artemis and played knucklebones with children. When asked why he was wasting his time playing games with kids instead of participating in politics, his reported answer was sharp. Is it not better to do this than to take part in your civil life? There is something both admirable and tragic in this posture. Heraclitus saw clearly. He saw the patterns that others missed, but what he saw made him lonely, and his loneliness made him more lonely still. The ancients called him the weeping philosopher, a counterpart to Democritus, the later atomist who was called the laughing philosopher. Two men looking at the same absurd world and arriving at opposite emotional responses. Democritus laughed at human folly. Heraclitus wept over it, not from weakness, but from a kind of wounded clarity. Eventually, according to the ancient accounts, he withdrew from Ephesus entirely and went to live alone in the mountains. eating only wild plants and grasses. It was during this period of solitude, either before or during his retreat, that he wrote his book. A single work, likely titled something like On Nature, though we cannot be certain. He brought it to the temple of Artemis and left it there, a deposit in the sacred treasury, as though his ideas were too valuable and too dangerous for ordinary commerce. And then he walked back into the hills and into the gathering silence of his own thought. Now, let us step into that thought. Let us begin where Heraclitus begins, with the observation that shattered the ancient world's search for something permanent. Everything flows. The Greek phrase is panta rhei, and even if you have never heard it in its original language, you have felt its truth in your bones. The milk you poured this morning has already begun to separate. The clouds you saw at sunset have dissolved into darkness. The city you grew up in has changed so gradually that you almost did not notice until you returned and found that the corner store was gone and a new building stood where a field used to be. Heraclitus saw this everywhere, not as a casual observation, but as the deepest truth about the nature of existence. Change is not something that happens to reality. Change is reality. The universe is not a collection of objects that sometimes move. It is movement itself. It is process all the way down. And the image he chose to express this insight has echoed through 25 centuries of human thought. The river. Upon those who step into the same rivers, different and ever different waters flow down. That is one version of the fragment, preserved by Plutarch. Another version, filtered through Plato's dialogue, the Cratylus, gives us the more familiar phrasing, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Most people hear this and think it is a poetic observation about water. The river keeps flowing, so it is never quite the same river from one moment to the next. That is true, but it is only the surface of what Heraclitus was saying. The deeper point, the one that has kept philosophers arguing for millennia, is that it is not just the river that changes. You change too. The person who steps into the river the first time is not the same person who steps in the second time. Your cells have divided and died. Your thoughts have shifted. Your experiences have accumulated. The you of 5 minutes ago is already a memory, and the you of 5 minutes from now does not yet exist. This is not metaphor. This is, in Heraclitus's view, literal truth about the structure of being. There are no permanent things. There are only processes that appear thing-like because our senses and our language are too slow and too crude to perceive the constant flux beneath the surface. Consider your own body for a moment. Modern biology tells us that most of the cells in your body are replaced over the course of roughly 7 to 10 years. The lining of your stomach renews itself every few days. Red blood cells last about 4 months. Even the cells in your bones are continuously broken down and rebuilt. The body you have tonight is materially different from the body you had a decade ago. Yet you still call yourself by the same name. You still look in the mirror and see you. What is this you that persists when everything it is made of keeps changing? Heraclitus would say that this is exactly the right question, and that the answer is not a thing, but a pattern. The river is a river not because it is made of the same water, but because the water keeps flowing in the same shape, through the same banks, following the same course. The form persists even as the substance transforms. And perhaps you are the same. Not a fixed entity, but a living pattern, a way of flowing that maintains its coherence even as everything within it changes. The ancient Greeks had another famous puzzle that circles the same mystery. It is called the ship of Theseus, and though it was formalized centuries after Heraclitus, it reads like a direct meditation on his ideas. Theseus, the legendary king of Athens, kept his ship in the harbor as a monument to his victory over the Minotaur. Over time, as planks rotted and ropes frayed, the Athenians replaced the damaged parts with new materials. One plank here, a mast there, a section of hull somewhere else. Eventually, every single piece of the original ship had been replaced. The question that haunted philosophers was simple. Is it still the ship of Theseus? And if someone had kept all the old planks and reassembled them into a second ship, which one would be the real one? Heraclitus would have cut through this puzzle like a hot blade. The question assumes that identity depends on material composition, on being made of the same stuff, but it does not. The ship is the ship because of its form, its function, its continuity through time. The pattern is what matters, not the planks. And the same is true of you. Modern neuroscience has added layers to this insight that Heraclitus could not have anticipated, but that would not have surprised him. Your memories, those anchors of personal identity that you rely on to know who you are not stored like recordings in a filing cabinet. Every time you remember something, your brain reconstructs the memory from scattered neural traces, and each reconstruction subtly alters the memory itself. The event you remember from 10 years ago is not the event as it happened. It is the event as you have remembered it and re-remembered it and re-re-remembered it, each recall slightly reshaping the original, like a story retold around a campfire, growing smoother and more dramatic with each telling. This means that even your sense of having a continuous personal history, that inner narrative that tells you who you are and where you came from, is itself a flowing process rather than a fixed record. You are not remembering the past so much as creating a story about the past. And that story changes every time you tell it to yourself. The river of memory is no less fluid than the river of cells. And yet something persists, something holds. You wake up each morning and recognize yourself. You look in the mirror and see a face that is yours, even though it has changed since yesterday, since last year, since childhood. You maintain relationships with people who knew the person you used to be, and those relationships still feel real even though both of you have been replaced, cell by cell, thought by thought, since the day you met. What is this continuity if not the pattern Heraclitus described? What is this you that endures through constant transformation, if not the shape of the river? There is something terrifying in this idea. If you are not a fixed thing, then what can you hold on to? If the ground beneath your identity is always shifting, how do you know who you are? These are the questions that kept later philosophers up at night, and they are the questions that make Heraclitus's fragments feel so startlingly modern. In an age of constant digital stimulation, of shifting social identities, of careers that change every few years and relationships that form and dissolve with dizzying speed, the ancient sage of Ephesus seems to be describing our world with uncomfortable precision. But here is the part that many people miss when they encounter Heraclitus for the first time. He was not preaching chaos. He was not saying that because everything changes, nothing matters. He was saying something far more subtle and far more beautiful. Yes, everything flows. Yes, you cannot hold the river still. But the flowing itself has a shape. The change itself follows a logic. And that logic, that deep pattern running through all things, is what Heraclitus called the Logos. We will come to the Logos soon. But first, we need to understand why Heraclitus chose fire as his symbol for the fundamental nature of reality. Because that choice tells us something essential about how he understood the relationship between destruction and creation, between ending and beginning, between the things that fall apart and the things that rise from the ashes. Of all the elements that the early Greek philosophers considered as candidates for the fundamental substance of the universe, fire is the strangest choice. Water has a kind of calm permanence to it. Air is invisible and ubiquitous. Earth is solid and reassuring. But fire is restless. It consumes what it touches. It transforms wood into ash and heat and light. It illuminates and destroys simultaneously. It is never the same shape from one moment to the next. You cannot hold it. You cannot store it. The instant it stops consuming, it ceases to exist. And that, for Heraclitus, was precisely the point. He wrote, "This world order, The same for all, no god nor man has made, but it always was and shall be, an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. This is one of the most important sentences in the history of Western philosophy, and it rewards careful attention. First, notice what he is saying about the cosmos. It was not created by any god or any person. It has always existed and always will. This was a radical claim in a world saturated with creation myths, where gods shaped the world from primordial chaos or breathed it into being from nothing. Heraclitus is saying that the universe needs no creator, because the universe is not a thing that was made. It is a process that has always been happening. Second, notice the phrase ever-living fire. The cosmos is not just any fire. It is a fire that never goes out, that sustains itself through its own transformations. It kindles in measures and goes out in measures. There is a rhythm to it, a balance. The fire does not burn randomly. It follows a pattern, consuming and creating in proportion, so that the total amount of stuff in the universe remains constant, even as individual things come and go. Heraclitus described a cosmic cycle in which fire transforms into water, and water transforms partly back into fire, and partly into earth, and then earth transforms back into water, and water back into fire. This is not quite modern chemistry, but it is remarkably close to the intuition that matter and energy are interconvertible, that nothing is truly destroyed but only changed from one form into another. 2,500 years before the laws of thermodynamics were formalized, a man sitting on a hillside in Ionia grasped the essential principle. The universe conserves itself through transformation. But fire was more than a cosmological symbol for Heraclitus. It was also a way of understanding the human soul. He believed that the soul was itself a kind of fire, and that its health and wisdom depended on remaining dry and bright. A dry soul is wisest and best, he wrote. Moisture, on the other hand, represented a dimming of the soul's fire. Drunkenness was a literal dampening of the spirit. A man, when he is drunk, is led by an unfledged boy stumbling and not knowing where he goes, having his soul moist. And death itself was the ultimate quenching. For souls, it is death to become water. There is something wonderfully vivid about this way of thinking. Imagine your awareness as a flame. When you are alert and engaged, thinking clearly, perceiving the world with sharp attention, your flame burns bright and hot. When you are drowsy or distracted, when you numb yourself with substances or lose yourself in mindless routine, the flame dims. And when you sleep, well, the fire does not go out entirely, but it settles into embers, waiting for the morning to kindle it again. This connection between fire and consciousness gives Heraclitus's cosmology a personal dimension that the other early philosophers lacked. When he talks about the ever-living fire of the cosmos, he is also talking about the fire within you. The same principle that drives the stars through their courses is the principle that lights up your mind when you think a clear thought or feel a genuine emotion. You are not separate from the cosmic fire. You are a particular expression of it, a flame kindled in measures and destined, eventually to go out in measures. But while you burn, you participate in the same eternal process that has always been and always will be. There is a fascinating resonance here with ideas that would not be formalized for more than 2 millennia. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed from one form to another. The total energy of a closed system remains constant. Heraclitus, watching fire consume wood and produce heat and light and ash, arrived at something startlingly similar through pure observation and reasoning. His ever-living fire kindling in measures and going out in measures is a poetic statement of conservation. The cosmic fire does not increase or diminish. It transforms. It exchanges itself for all things, and all things for fire. as goods for gold and gold for goods, as he put it in another fragment. The metaphor of currency exchange is revealing. When you trade gold for goods, neither the gold nor the goods are destroyed. They change hands, they change form. The total value is preserved, and so it is with fire. The second law of thermodynamics, the tendency of systems toward entropy, toward disorder and dissipation, might seem to challenge Heraclitus's vision. But even here, there is a surprising harmony. Entropy is not the opposite of order. It is itself a kind of transformation, a movement from concentrated energy toward dispersed energy, from structure toward formlessness. And Heraclitus, who believed that the cosmic fire perpetually cycles between creation and dissolution, between the way down from fire to sea to earth and the way up from earth to sea to fire, had already intuited that the universe operates through an endless dialogue between construction and destruction. The philosopher also seems to have believed in periodic cosmic conflagration, a great burning in which all things return to fire before the cycle begins again. The Stoics later developed this idea into their doctrine of ekpyrosis, the periodic destruction and rebirth of the cosmos through fire. Whether Heraclitus himself held this specific view is debated by scholars, but the concept fits naturally with his understanding of fire as both beginning and end, both creator and destroyer. What makes all of this more than abstract cosmology is the personal stake. If your soul is fire, then everything that applies to the cosmic fire applies to you as well. You kindle in measures, you burn for a time. You will go out in measures, but the fire that animated you will not cease to exist. It will transform. It will become something else, just as it was something else before it became you. And the pattern, the logos, that governed your particular burning will continue to operate in whatever the fire becomes next. This is not quite reincarnation in the Hindu or Buddhist sense. It is something more like participation in an eternal process that transcends any individual flame while including every individual flame. As you lie here tonight, feeling the warmth of your blankets and the gradual softening of your thoughts as sleep approaches, consider that even this gentle fading of consciousness is a kind of transformation. You are not losing yourself. You are changing states, the way water becomes steam or ice becomes water. The fire dims but does not disappear. It will return with the morning. And in the meantime, the embers of your awareness glow quietly in the darkness, tending themselves through the long hours until dawn. Now we come to the heart of Heraclitus's philosophy, the concept that holds everything else together. If everything flows, if the cosmos is an ever-living fire perpetually transforming itself, then what prevents the whole thing from dissolving into meaningless chaos? What gives the river its banks? What gives the fire its measures? What holds the pattern in place while everything within the pattern keeps changing? Heraclitus had a word for this. He called it the logos. The word itself is deceptively familiar. In ancient Greek, logos could mean word, speech, reason, account, ratio, discourse, or meaning. It is one of the most versatile and slippery words in the Greek language, and Heraclitus exploited every shade of its meaning. When later Christian writers used the term at the opening of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," they were drawing on a tradition of cosmic significance that traces directly back to the philosopher of Ephesus. But what did Heraclitus himself mean by it? The logos, as Heraclitus understood it, is the underlying rational structure that governs all change. It is not a god in the traditional sense. It is not a person, or a will, or a mind sitting outside the universe and directing traffic. It is more like a law, a pattern, an organizing principle that is woven into the fabric of reality itself. It is the reason why fire transforms into water in measures rather than at random. It is the reason why day follows night and winter follows summer. It is the reason why the river maintains its shape even as the water within it is constantly replaced. The very first fragment of Heraclitus's book, or at least the fragment that most scholars believe opened his work, announces the logos with characteristic confidence and frustration. Of this logos, being forever do men prove to be uncomprehending, both before they hear and once they have heard it. For although all things happen according to this logos, men are like people of no experience, even when they do experience such words and deeds, as I explain. The logos is always there. It governs everything. And yet, people cannot see it. They sleepwalk through a world structured by rational law and never notice the law itself. They hear the words and miss the meaning. They see the fire and never wonder why it burns in measures. This is what separated Heraclitus from the Milesian philosophers who came before him. Thales looked at the world and asked, "What is it made of?" Heraclitus looked at the world and asked, "What is the pattern?" He was not searching for a substance but for a structure, not for an ingredient but for an intelligence. And what he found was not something you could hold in your hands, but something you could apprehend with your mind if you were willing to pay close enough attention. Listening not to me but to the logos, he wrote, it is wise to agree that all things are one. This is a remarkable sentence. He is directing his readers away from himself, away from any particular authority, and toward the pattern itself. Do not trust me because I say it, trust it because it is true. Look at the world, really look, and you will see that beneath the apparent diversity of things, beneath the multiplicity of forms and substances and experiences, there is a single organizing principle that makes all of it cohere. The logos is common to all. It is shared, public, available to anyone with the wits to perceive it. And yet most people live as though they inhabit private worlds of their own invention. The waking have one common world, Heraclitus observed, but the sleeping turn aside each into a world of his own. This is one of his most haunting fragments, and it acquired new life in the 20th century when existential psychologists adopted the term idios kosmos, Heraclitus's phrase for a private world, to describe the experience of people suffering from delusions. The novelist Philip K. Dick, who was fascinated by the boundary between shared reality and personal hallucination, found in Heraclitus a kindred spirit. But Heraclitus was not just making a point about psychology. He was making a point about reality. The logos is the common pattern, the shared structure, the public truth. When you are truly awake, truly paying attention, you perceive this common world and your place within it. When you are asleep to the logos, whether literally asleep or simply going through life on autopilot, you retreat into a private bubble of assumptions and habits and unexamined beliefs. You mistake your personal perspective for the whole of reality. You think your way of seeing things is the way things are, and in doing so, you cut yourself off from the deeper truth that connects you to everything else. There is something profoundly comforting about the concept of the logos, especially at night, especially when the mind is winding down and the world outside the window feels large and unknowable. It suggests that the universe is not random, that behind the apparent chaos of events, behind the relentless flux of everything changing into everything else, there is an order, a logic, a reason, not imposed from outside, but intrinsic to reality itself. The river flows, but it flows somewhere. The fire burns, but it burns in measures. The seasons turn, but they turn in a cycle. And the pattern that governs all of this is available to you right now, in this very moment, if you are willing to listen. Even the rhythm of your breathing follows the logos. The air enters your lungs and exits again, a tiny cycle within the larger cycles of day and night, of waking and sleeping, of living and dying. You did not design this pattern. You do not maintain it consciously. It simply operates reliably, faithfully, carrying you through the night as it has carried every living creature that has ever drawn breath. In recognizing this pattern, even dimly, even half asleep, you participate in the same awareness that Heraclitus was pointing toward 25 centuries ago. He had other ways of expressing this insight, each fragment adding another facet to the central idea. The sun is new each day, he wrote. On the surface, this seems to contradict common sense. We see the same sunrise every morning, but Heraclitus was pointing at something subtler. The fire of the sun is continuously burning, continuously consuming fuel, continuously emitting light that was not the same light it emitted a moment ago. The sun you saw set yesterday and the sun that will rise tomorrow are continuous expressions of the same process, but they are not identical objects. The sun is a river of fire flowing through time just as you are flowing through time, maintaining its identity through constancy of pattern rather than permanence of substance. Nature loves to hide, he wrote in another fragment, and this small sentence contains volumes. The logos does not announce itself with trumpets. It does not label its operations with neon signs. You have to look for it. You have to learn to see the pattern beneath the surface chaos. The seasons do not explain themselves to the trees, yet the trees respond perfectly, shedding their leaves when the time is right, sending up new growth when the warmth returns. The tides do not explain themselves to the shore, yet the shore responds, shaped over millennia by the patient rhythm of advance and retreat. The logos is present in all of this, but it is hidden, not because it is deliberately concealed, but because it operates at a level that casual observation misses. This is why Heraclitus was so frustrated with people who accumulated knowledge without understanding. You can memorize the positions of every star in the sky and still not grasp the pattern that governs their movements. You can catalog every species of plant and animal and still not perceive the web of relationships that connects them. Knowledge of facts is not the same as perception of pattern. And it is the pattern that matters. There is a parallel here with the experience of listening to music. A trained musician can identify every note in a symphony, name every chord, describe every dynamic marking. But the beauty of the music does not reside in any individual note. It resides in the relationships between notes, in the patterns of tension and resolution that unfold over time. The logos of the music is the pattern, not the notes. And to truly hear the music, you must let go of the individual details and allow the larger form to emerge. Heraclitus was asking us to listen to the universe the way a musician listens to a symphony, not by dissecting it into components, but by perceiving the harmony that connects everything to everything else. All things are one, he insisted, not because they are made of the same substance, but because they participate in the same pattern, follow the same logic, express the same underlying rational order. But if the logos is a pattern of harmony and order, why does the world so often feel like a battlefield? Why is there suffering, conflict, destruction, loss? Why do things fall apart? Heraclitus had an answer to this question, and it is perhaps the most counterintuitive and challenging aspect of his entire philosophy. He believed that conflict is not the enemy of order. Conflict is what creates order. Opposition is not the opposite of harmony. Opposition is the source of harmony. And the tension between contraries, the push and pull of opposing forces, is not a flaw in the fabric of the universe, but the very thread from which it is woven. War is father of all and king of all, he declared. And some he manifested as gods, some as men, some he made slaves, some free. Now, before you recoil from this, before you hear it as a glorification of violence or a celebration of cruelty, take a moment to hear what Heraclitus is actually saying. The word he uses for war is polemos, and he does not mean only military conflict. He means the universal principle of opposition, of tension, of contrast. He means the fact that nothing in the universe exists in isolation. Everything exists in relation to its opposite. And it is this relationship, this creative friction between contraries, that brings things into being and gives them their definition. Think of a bow. The bow exists in a state of tension between the string pulling inward and the wood pushing outward. If you remove the tension, the bow ceases to function. It becomes a stick and a loose piece of cord. The very thing that makes it a bow, the very thing that gives it its power and purpose, is the opposition between its parts. The same is true of a lyre. The strings are pulled taut across the frame. If you release the tension, you lose the music. Harmony, actual musical harmony, depends on the right degree of tension between different notes. Heraclitus captured this insight in one of his most beautiful fragments. They do not understand how that which differs with itself is in agreement. Harmony consists of opposing tension, like that of the bow and the lyre. This is the unity of opposites, and it runs through everything Heraclitus touched. Cold things become warm. Warm things become cold. The living die. The dead nourish new life. The road up and the road down are one and the same. Day and night are not two separate things, but two aspects of a single process. Health and disease, fullness and hunger, rest and wakefulness, each exists only because its opposite exists. Take away the contrast and you take away the thing itself. This was a direct challenge to the way most people thought about the world. We tend to see opposites as enemies. We want to eliminate suffering and keep only joy. We want to banish darkness and live entirely in light. We want permanence and fear change. But Heraclitus is saying that this desire is not just impossible to fulfill, it is incoherent. If you could eliminate all suffering, you would also eliminate the meaning of joy, because joy only means something in contrast to suffering. If you could freeze everything in place and stop all change, you would not preserve life. You would destroy it, because life is change. Life is the movement between opposites. Life is the tension in the string. Consider how this applies to the rhythm of your own experience. You are lying here at the end of a day that probably contained both pleasant and unpleasant moments. You may have felt productive and lazy, connected and lonely, hopeful and anxious. All in the span of a few hours. Heraclitus would say that these oscillations are not a sign that something is wrong with your life. They are your life. The movement between these states is what it means to be alive. And the deep rest you are moving toward right now would have no sweetness, no relief, no restorative power if you had not been awake and active and engaged during the hours that preceded it. Rest means something because effort means something. Silence means something because noise means something. Sleep means something because waking means something. And the boundary between these opposites is not a wall but a threshold, a place of transformation where one thing becomes another without any real gap between them. Look at the natural world through Heraclitean eyes, and you begin to see the unity of opposites everywhere. The forest fire that devastates a landscape is also the event that clears dead wood, releases nutrients locked in decades of accumulated debris, and opens the canopy to sunlight that allows dormant seeds to germinate. Ecologists now understand that fire suppression, the attempt to eliminate one half of the opposition, actually creates conditions for more catastrophic burns later. The forest needs the fire. The creation depends on the destruction. Your own body runs on the same principle. Every moment, cells in your body are dying and new cells are being born. Your immune system maintains your health by waging constant microscopic warfare against invaders. The acid in your stomach that dissolves food would dissolve your own tissues if not held in check by the mucus lining that continually regenerates. You are at the biological level a harmony of opposing tensions. Take away any one side of these oppositions, and the whole system collapses. Even the psychological rhythms of daily experience follow the pattern. The focus and concentration you bring to demanding work are only possible because periods of rest and mental wandering Allow your neural circuits to recover and consolidate. Creativity research has shown that breakthrough insights often arrive not during periods of intense effort, but during the relaxation that follows, when the mind is allowed to drift and make unexpected connections. The tension between focused attention and open awareness, between discipline and freedom, between the analytical and the intuitive, is not a flaw in human cognition. It is the engine that drives discovery. Heraclitus captured all of this in a single image that has haunted philosophy ever since. The way up and the way down are one and the same. He may have been thinking of mountain paths that serve for both ascent and descent. He may have been thinking of the cosmic cycle in which fire descends into water and earth and water ascend back into fire. But the deeper point is that what looks like two opposite movements from one perspective is actually a single path viewed from different angles. The road does not change. Only your direction on it changes. And the road, the underlying structure of reality, contains both directions within itself, equally, simultaneously, necessarily. Heraclitus also applied the unity of opposites to ethical and social life. Gods and men honor those slain in war, he observed. Greater deaths gain greater portions. This is not a bloodthirsty sentiment. It is an observation that courage, honor, and sacrifice only have meaning in the context of danger, dishonor, and loss. The virtues we admire most highly are precisely those that emerge under the pressure of opposition. Patience is meaningless without frustration. Generosity is meaningless without scarcity. Compassion is meaningless without suffering. The things we value most in human character are forged in the fire of opposition, not preserved in the stillness of comfort. There was another philosopher, slightly younger than Heraclitus, who took the exact opposite position. His name was Parmenides, and he lived in the Greek colony of Elea in southern Italy. Parmenides argued that change itself is an illusion. True reality, he claimed, is eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and perfect. What we perceive as change, as movement, as becoming, is merely the confusion of our unreliable senses. If you could see reality as it truly is, you would see that nothing ever changes at all. Being simply is, and that is the end of the matter. The tension between Heraclitus and Parmenides would define the next several centuries of Greek philosophy. Plato tried to reconcile them by positing a world of unchanging forms behind the changing world of appearances. Aristotle developed his own synthesis, arguing for both change and stability through his concepts of potentiality and actuality. But the debate itself, the opposition between flux and permanence, between becoming and being, was itself a kind of Heraclean proof. Two thinkers pushing in opposite directions and the creative tension between them producing some of the richest philosophical thought in human history. Heraclitus would have appreciated the irony. The very disagreement proved his point. Without the opposition, there would have been no progress. Now let me tell you about the man behind these ideas, because the personality of Heraclitus is as fascinating and as instructive as his philosophy. The ancients did not merely call him the Dark One for his obscure writing style. They also painted him as one of the most difficult human beings in the history of thought. Heraclitus was by all accounts unsparing in his assessment of other people. He considered himself self-taught and seemed to regard this as a point of pride. "I searched for myself," he wrote, in a fragment that stands out for its intimacy among all the cosmic pronouncements. This self-directed inquiry set him apart from the schools and traditions that were beginning to form around other thinkers. He did not sit at anyone's feet. He did not join any movement. He went inward, and what he found there was the same logos he saw operating in the world outside. But this independence came at a cost. He criticized nearly everyone. Homer, the greatest poet in the Greek tradition, deserved to be driven out of the contests and beaten with a stick. Pythagoras, whose mathematical mysticism was attracting followers across the Greek world, practiced a craft of mischief. Hesiod, the great chronicler of gods and origins, was another target. Much learning does not teach understanding, Heraclitus wrote, and you can feel the barb aimed at every scholar who mistakes information for wisdom. He was not gentle with ordinary citizens either. The people of Ephesus, his own neighbors, bore the brunt of his contempt when they banished a man named Hermodorus, whom Heraclitus considered the most capable among them. He reportedly said that the Ephesians should all hang themselves and leave the city to children, for they have cast out Hermodorus, the most worthy man among them, saying, "Let no one of us be the most worthy, or if there be such a one, let him go elsewhere among others." There is a story, almost certainly legendary but preserved by Diogenes Laertius, about an exchange of letters between Heraclitus and Darius the Great, king of Persia. Darius, supposedly having heard of Heraclitus's wisdom, wrote to invite him to the Persian court. Heraclitus's reply is magnificent in its disdain. All the men that exist in the world are far removed from truth and just dealings, but they are full of evil foolishness, which leads them to insatiable covetousness and vain glorious ambition. I, however, forgetting all their worthlessness, will never come to Persia, since I am quite contented with a little, and live as best suits my own inclination. Whether or not this exchange actually happened, it captures something essential about the man. He could not be bought, could not be tempted by any power that the world could offer. Yet there is another way to read Heraclitus's difficult personality. Behind the arrogance, behind the contempt, behind the refusal to engage with the world he saw as sleepwalking through existence, there is something that looks very much like grief. He was not angry at people for being stupid. He was heartbroken that they chose not to see what was right in front of them. The logos is common to all. It is available to everyone, and yet, although it is common, most people live as though they had an understanding peculiar to themselves. He was not looking down on humanity from some position of smug superiority. He was standing in the middle of a crowded room, pointing at something obvious and watching in disbelief as everyone turned away. This is why the ancients remembered him as the weeping philosopher. His tears were not for himself, but for the human condition, for the gap between what we could understand and what we choose to ignore, for the way we stumble through our days with our souls damp and our fires dim, never quite waking up to the extraordinary reality humming through every atom of our existence. And there is a loneliness in this that anyone who has ever felt truly out of step with the world around them will recognize. The loneliness of seeing something that others refuse to see. The ache of possessing a truth that by its very nature cannot be forced on anyone, but must be discovered by each person for themselves. Heraclitus wrote his book in riddles because the truth he had to share could not be transmitted like information. It had to be experienced like fire. And if you were not ready to feel the heat, no amount of clear explanation would help. But perhaps there is another layer to his loneliness, one that the ancient sources only hint at. Heraclitus was a man born into privilege who walked away from it. He was a man of obvious intellectual power who refused to use that power in conventional ways. He would not write laws for the city, though the citizens asked him to. He would not take students, though his ideas attracted attention across the Greek world. He would not travel to foreign courts, though kings invited him. Every door that the world opened for him, he closed. And each closed door left him more isolated, more dependent on his own internal resources, more committed to the solitary path he had chosen. There is something in this that resonates deeply in our own time. The feeling of being surrounded by people who are absorbed in trivial concerns, while something vast and important goes unnoticed. The frustration of watching friends and colleagues chase goals that you sense will not bring them what they are really looking for. The temptation to withdraw, to stop trying to communicate, to retreat into the mountains of your own mind, and live on whatever wild grasses your solitary thoughts can provide. Heraclitus was not the last person to feel this way. He may have been the first to articulate it with such fierce precision, but his withdrawal was not complete. He wrote the book, he brought it to the temple, he placed it among the treasures for anyone to find. Even in his bitterness, even in his contempt, there was an act of generosity buried beneath the surface. He could have kept his insides to himself. He could have let his fire burn in private and taken his understanding to the grave. Instead, he carved his wisdom into words and left them where they could be found. He trusted that somewhere, sometime, someone would be ready to hear what he had to say. And he was right. 2,500 years later, here you are, listening. That is a kind of faith when you think about it. Not faith in people as they are, because Heraclitus had no illusions about that, but faith in the logos, faith that the pattern working through all things would eventually bring his words to minds capable of receiving them. The seeds he planted in the temple were not for his generation. They were for the river of generations that would flow through that temple for centuries after he was gone. Speaking of his book, let us dwell for a moment on the strange and beautiful way Heraclitus's words have survived. He wrote, as far as we know, a single work. The ancient sources call it On Nature, though this was a generic title applied to many early philosophical texts and may not have been Heraclitus's own choice. The book was deposited in the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, placed among the sacred treasures as a kind of intellectual offering to the goddess and to posterity. The original is long lost. What survived are fragments, over 100 of them, preserved as quotations in the works of later writers. Plato and Aristotle reference him. The Stoics studied him intensely. Plutarch, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, and many others quoted his words across a span of 7 centuries, each drawing on different copies or different memories of the original text. By the 6th century of the Common Era, the original book was apparently so rare that even the scholars of the Platonic Academy in Athens could no longer access it. What we have left, then, are like pieces of a shattered mosaic. Each fragment is complete in itself, a polished gem of compressed meaning. But the connections between them, the original context, the way one thought led to another in Heraclitus's own arrangement, all of this is lost. Scholars have spent centuries trying to reconstruct the original order, with results that range from plausible to wildly speculative. But here is the beautiful thing about the fragments. Their very brevity and independence give them a power that a complete text might not have had. Each fragment is like a seed, small enough to carry in your memory, dense enough with meaning to unfold across a lifetime of reflection. The way up and the way down are one and the same. You can think about that sentence for years. Character is destiny, 4 syllables that contain an entire theory of human life. The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither declares nor conceals, but shows by sign. A description of how truth works that applies equally to the Delphic oracle, to Heraclitus's own writing, and to the Logos itself. Heraclitus wrote like the oracle he admired. He did not explain. He did not argue. He pointed, and if you could follow where his finger pointed, you would see for yourself. But if you could not, then no amount of explanation would help, because what he was pointing at was not a fact to be memorized, but a reality to be perceived. Aristotle, who valued clarity and systematic argument above all things, found Heraclitus maddening. He complained about the ambiguity of his sentences, about the way his syntax made it impossible to tell where one thought ended and the next began. Aristotle's frustration is understandable. When you are trying to build a rigorous philosophical system, a thinker who refuses to state his premises clearly is an obstacle rather than a help. But Heraclitus was doing something different from what Aristotle wanted to do. He was not constructing an argument. He was constructing an experience. His sentences were designed not to convey information, but to provoke perception, to shake the reader out of habitual ways of seeing and force them to look at reality with fresh eyes. Consider a few more of the fragments that have survived, because each one is a small world unto itself. Dogs bark at what they do not know. On the surface, an observation about animal behavior, but underneath, a devastating commentary on how human beings respond to unfamiliar ideas. We bark at what we do not understand, rather than investigating it. We reject what is strange rather than allowing it to challenge our assumptions. The metaphor is not flattering, and it was not meant to be. If all things became smoke, the nostrils would distinguish them. This is a thought experiment 2,500 years before thought experiments became a standard philosophical method. If the entire visible world were reduced to a single substance, would distinction still be possible? Heraclitus says yes. Even in apparent uniformity, difference persists. The nose can distinguish between the smoke of burning cedar and the smoke of burning olive wood. Form endures even when substance changes. Pattern survives transformation. The sea is the purest and most polluted water. For fish, it is drinkable and life-sustaining. For people, it is undrinkable and deadly. Here the unity of opposites appears again, but in a form that challenges our assumptions about absolute qualities. Nothing is simply pure or simply polluted. Purity and pollution are relative to the nature of the creature that encounters them. What saves one kills another. What nourishes the fish poisons the human. The same substance, the same water, contains both life and death, depending on the perspective from which it is approached. Each of these fragments is a door. Walk through it, and you find yourself in a room larger than you expected, with more corridors leading off into further chambers of meaning. Scholars have built entire careers on the interpretation of single sentences. And the fact that we have only fragments, only shards of the original whole, has paradoxically increased their power. We read them the way we read poetry, rather than prose, attending to every word, every possible shade of meaning, every ambiguity and resonance. The brokenness of the text forces us to do the interpretive work that Heraclitus wanted us to do all along. We cannot passively absorb his message. We must actively reconstruct it, and in doing so, we become the kind of attentive, pattern-seeking minds he was trying to create. This brings us, gently, to the end of Heraclitus's life. Or rather, to the legend of his end, because what the ancient sources tell us about his death is almost certainly a myth, but a myth so perfectly suited to his philosophy that it deserves to be told. According to Diogenes Laertius, Heraclitus spent his final years as a complete misanthrope, living alone in the mountains, eating nothing but grasses and wild plants. This austere diet, the story goes, eventually caused him to develop dropsy, which we would now call edema, a swelling caused by the accumulation of fluid beneath the skin. In pain and growing desperate, he came down from the mountains and returned to Ephesus to consult the city's doctors. But he could not help being himself. Even in his suffering, he posed his medical problem as a riddle. "Can you make a drought out of rainy weather?" he asked the physicians. They had no idea what he was talking about. The man who had spent his life speaking in parables found, at the very end, that his habit of indirection had left him unable to communicate even his most basic needs. What happened next is grotesque, and almost certainly fictional. Heraclitus decided to treat himself. His theory, apparently based on his own philosophical principles about the interchange of hot and cold, wet and dry, was that if his body was too wet, he needed to dry it out. So he covered himself in cow dung, hoping that the warmth of the fresh manure would draw the fluid from his tissues through evaporation. One version says he died in a cattle stall, alone and covered in filth. Another says his servants plastered him with dung in the open sun, and he died the next day. A third version, attributed to Meanthes of Cyzicus, adds the gruesome detail that the dung hardened around him, rendering him unrecognizable, and he was devoured by dogs. Scholars are nearly unanimous that this story is a fabrication, probably invented by later biographers working backward from Heraclitus's own fragments. For souls, it is death to become water becomes the ironic basis for a death by dropsy, a condition characterized by excess fluid. The philosopher of fire and dryness dies of water and wetness. It is too neat, too perfect, too poetically satisfying to be true. As the scholar Janet Fairweather argued, this kind of biographical invention, where a philosopher's death is constructed from their own famous sayings, was a common literary convention in antiquity. But the legend persists, and perhaps there is something valuable in it even as fiction. Here is a man who spent his life insisting that everything changes, that fire consumes and creates, that the soul must remain dry and bright. And in the end, according to the story, the very forces he described turned against him. Water invaded his body, the fire dimmed. The transformation he understood so clearly in the abstract became brutally personal. Even the philosopher of change could not exempt himself from change. He reportedly died around 475 BCE at the age of 60. Whatever the actual circumstances, his ideas outlived him by an immeasurable margin. And those ideas flowed like a river through the centuries that followed, shaping minds and movements that Heraclitus could never have imagined. The first and most immediate impact was on Plato. Though Plato never met Heraclitus, he was deeply influenced by Heraclitean ideas through Cratylus, a follower of Heraclitus who took the flux doctrine to its extreme. Cratylus reportedly argued that you could not step into the same river even once, since both you and the river are changing so rapidly that the concept of the same has no stable meaning at all. This radical position unsettled the young Plato and drove him toward the opposite conclusion. If the physical world is in constant flux, then true knowledge must concern something beyond the physical world, something permanent, unchanging, and eternal. Thus were born Plato's forms, those perfect, unchanging templates of which physical things are merely imperfect copies. In a sense, the entire theory of forms is Plato's attempt to answer Heraclitus. If everything flows, where does truth reside? Plato said, not in the flowing, but in the pattern behind it. Aristotle took a different approach. He did not deny change, but he sought to explain how change and stability could coexist. His concepts of potentiality and actuality, of form and matter, of substance and accident, can all be read as sophisticated responses to the Heraclitean challenge. How can something change and still remain the same thing? Aristotle's answer involved distinguishing between essential and accidental properties, between what a thing fundamentally is and the various ways it can be modified. A seed is potentially a tree. A tree is actually what the seed had the potential to become. Change is real, but it is not random. It is directed by the nature of the thing that changes. But it was the Stoics who embraced Heraclitus most fully. The great Stoic school of philosophy, founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE, adopted Heraclitean concepts as foundational pillars of their system. The Logos became, for the Stoics, the divine rational principle that pervades and governs the entire cosmos. Fire became the creative force that runs through all things, giving them form and life. The unity of opposites became the basis for the Stoic doctrine that virtue lies in living according to nature, accepting the full spectrum of experience rather than trying to escape from suffering into pleasure. The scholar Charles Kahn went so far as to call the Stoics the true Heracliteans of antiquity. Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, wrote a 4-volume commentary on Heraclitus that has unfortunately been lost, and Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations have become one of the most beloved works in all of philosophy, drew repeatedly on Heraclitean themes. All things are in a process of change, Marcus wrote. You yourself are undergoing a continuous transformation, and in some sense, a continuous destruction. This is Heraclitus, filtered through 3 centuries of Stoic refinement, speaking directly to the anxieties of a Roman emperor who understood that even the most powerful man in the world is powerless against the current of time. The influence continued into modern philosophy with astonishing force. But before we get there, it is worth noting how Heraclitean ideas survived the collapse of the ancient world and traveled through centuries of intellectual history to reach the modern age. The early Christian theologians found in Heraclitus a surprising ally. The Gospel of John, written in Greek, opens with the declaration, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was God, and the Logos was God." Church fathers like Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, explicitly connected the Johannine Logos with the philosophical concept that Heraclitus had introduced 6 centuries earlier. Justin even argued that Heraclitus, by living according to the Logos, was in some sense a Christian before Christianity existed. This theological adoption ensured that Heraclitean ideas, even when the original fragments were inaccessible, continued to circulate through Western culture embedded within Christian philosophy. The concept of a rational divine principle governing all of reality, of a hidden order beneath apparent chaos, of a truth that is available to all but perceived by few, these became part of the intellectual atmosphere of medieval Europe. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered the Greek philosophical texts and began reading them in the original language, they found in Heraclitus not a stranger but a distant ancestor whose family resemblance they could already recognize. The Reformation and the scientific revolution brought new energy to Heraclitean themes. The emphasis on direct observation of nature, on discovering the laws that govern natural processes, on trusting evidence over authority, all of these echo the philosopher who told his listeners to attend to the logos rather than to the opinions of famous men. When Galileo insisted that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, he was expressing, in the idiom of his own time, the same conviction that had driven Heraclitus to search for the rational pattern underlying all change. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the towering figure of German idealism, declared that there is no proposition of Heraclitus which I have not adopted in my logic. This is an extraordinary claim from a philosopher whose dialectical method, with its famous triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, is essentially a formalization of the Heraclitean insight that truth emerges from the clash of opposites. Hegel's entire system, his understanding of history as a progressive unfolding of spirit through contradiction and resolution, is a debt to the philosopher of Ephesus. Friedrich Nietzsche felt an even deeper personal connection. He called Heraclitus the proud, lonely truth finder, and saw in him a predecessor to his own philosophy of affirmation. Where Heraclitus embraced the creative destruction of fire, Nietzsche embraced the eternal recurrence of the same and the will to power. Both thinkers rejected the comfort of permanence and stared into the flux without flinching. Nietzsche considered Heraclitus the first tragic philosopher, a thinker who accepted the full weight of existence without retreating into comforting illusions or moral optimism. Martin Heidegger, perhaps the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, returned to Heraclitus again and again throughout his career. Heidegger believed that the thinking of Heraclitus and Parmenides represented the original experience of philosophy, an experience that was subsequently misunderstood and distorted by Plato and Aristotle. To recover the genuine meaning of being, Heidegger argued, we must go back behind the Platonic tradition to the pre-Socratic origins, back to the moment when Heraclitus glimpsed the Logos and tried to put what he saw into words. In the 20th century, phenomenological and existential psychologists adopted Heraclitean language to describe the nature of human consciousness. The concept of idios cosmos, the private world of the dreamer, or the delusional, became a clinical term. Process philosophy, developed by thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead, built directly on the Heraclitean vision of reality as dynamic, relational, and perpetually in motion. And in 2000, a major work of psychology published by Cambridge University Press explicitly grounded itself in Heraclean thought, arguing that the human mind is best understood not as a fixed mechanism, but as a flowing process. All of this from a single book deposited in a temple by a man who preferred the company of children to the company of kings. The fragments that survived his lost work are like sparks thrown from a bonfire, each one small enough to hold in your hand, but collectively capable of setting entire traditions of thought ablaze. Now, let us bring all of this home. Let us bring Heraclitus into the room where you are lying right now, into the quiet of your own breathing, into the space between your thoughts. If Heraclitus was right, and I think there is a great deal of evidence that he was, at least about the central insight, then you are not a thing. You are a process. You are not a noun. You are a verb. The person who started listening to this recording has already changed. New thoughts have entered your mind, new images have formed, new neural connections have been made, and old ones have slightly shifted. The cells in your body have continued their quiet work of division and repair. The air in your lungs has been exchanged hundreds of times. You are, in a very literal sense, not the same person you were 90 minutes ago. And if that is true, then something follows that is both frightening and liberating. If you are not a fixed entity, then your past does not own you. The mistakes you made last year, the failures you carry, the versions of yourself you are embarrassed by, these are like water that has already flowed down the river. They shaped the banks. They carved the channel, but they are gone. The river you are now is fed by new sources, flowing toward new destinations. You are not imprisoned by who you were. You are defined by what you are becoming. But this also means that you bear a responsibility. If you are always in the process of becoming, then you have a choice about what you become. Every day, every hour, every quiet moment of decision is an act of self-creation. The habits you cultivate, the thoughts you entertain, the relationships you invest in, these are the measures by which your particular fire kindles and goes out. You are not a finished product waiting to be discovered. You are a fire in the process of burning, and the quality of that fire depends, at least in part, on the choices you make about what to feed it. Heraclitus would add something else, something that may be the most comforting insight of all. You are not burning alone. The logos that governs the turning of the stars also governs the turning of your thoughts. The pattern that holds the seasons in their cycle also holds your life in its arc. You do not have to understand the pattern completely to participate in it. You do not have to see the whole river to know that you are flowing. The very fact that you are here, alive, breathing, wondering about the meaning of your existence, is evidence that the Logos is at work within you, whether you call it reason, or nature, or something else entirely. And the opposites that make your life difficult, the tension between what you want and what you have, between who you are and who you wish to be, between the joy of connection and the ache of loss, these are not evidence that something has gone wrong. They are evidence that you are alive. The bow and the lyre. The tension that makes the music possible. Without the pull between opposites, there would be no harmony. And without the struggle, there would be no growth. As you lie here tonight, your body settling deeper into rest, your thoughts beginning to soften and blur at the edges, you are enacting one of the most fundamental transformations in human experience. You are crossing from waking to sleeping, from one world to another. Heraclitus knew that this crossing happens every night, and he found in it a small proof of his entire philosophy. The waking have one common world. The sleeping turn aside, each into a world of their own. And every morning the crossing reverses, and you return to the common world, slightly changed by whatever happened in the private darkness of your dreams. Tonight, as you make that crossing, carry with you something of what Heraclitus saw on his hillside above Ephesus. The world is fire. everything changes. And in the heart of that change, holding it all together, there is a pattern so deep and so ancient that it was old before the mountains were formed and will endure long after the last star burns out. Think about what happens to a river at night. The water does not stop flowing because the sun has gone down. The current continues its work in darkness, wearing at the banks, carrying sediment downstream, feeding the roots of trees that line the shore. The river does not need daylight to be a river. It does not need to be observed to continue its journey. And neither do you. When consciousness fades into sleep, the processes that define you do not stop. Your heart continues pumping. Your lungs continue breathing. The neurons in your brain continue forming new connections, pruning old ones, reorganizing the information gathered during the day into more efficient patterns. You are still flowing. You are still becoming. The river of your identity does not pause for the night. There is something deeply reassuring about this. So much of our anxiety about change comes from the feeling that we must consciously manage every aspect of our transformation. We worry about making the right decisions, cultivating the right habits, becoming the right kind of person, as though our identity were a project we could fail at if we lost concentration for a moment. But Heraclitus reminds us that the logos operates whether we are aware of it or not. The pattern holds even when we are not watching. The fire tends itself. Think, too, about what rivers do over long stretches of time. They carve canyons, not through any single dramatic event, but through the patient, persistent movement of water over stone across thousands and millions of years. The Grand Canyon was not created by a flood. It was created by a river that never stopped flowing. And the character you are building, the person you are becoming, works the same way. It is not the dramatic moments that define you, though those moments may reveal who you already are. It is the daily flowing, the small choices repeated so often they become invisible, the quiet persistence of your attention and care and effort, day after day, year after year, that carves the shape of your life into something recognizable and enduring. Heraclitus told us that character is destiny. He meant that the pattern of your choices, the direction of your flow, determines where the river goes. You cannot choose to stop flowing, but you can, within limits, choose the direction. You can decide what to feed the fire. You can decide which banks to follow. And over time, those small directional choices accumulate into something that looks, from a distance, like a life lived with purpose. You are part of that pattern, not as a permanent fixture, but as a living expression, a flame kindled in measures and destined, in time, to go out in measures. But while you burn, you are participating in something eternal. The fire that animates your consciousness tonight is the same fire that Heraclitus described 2,500 years ago. It is the same fire that lights the sun. It is the same fire that will warm the beings who come after us, long after our names have been forgotten and our bones have returned to the earth. If you have found rest in these ancient ideas tonight, it would mean a great deal if you could leave a like and subscribe to help these gentle explorations reach other nighttime wanderers looking for meaning in the quiet hours. Your presence here is part of the community of seekers that makes this channel possible, and I am deeply grateful for each and every one of you. Now, let the current carry you. Let the fire settle into embers. Let the opposites of thought and silence, waking and sleeping, find their natural balance in the harmony that holds your life together. Heraclitus told us that character is destiny, and the simple fact that you spent tonight in the company of ideas that are older than empires tells you something true about the kind of person you are becoming. The river flows. The fire burns. The logos holds. And you, dear friend, are exactly where you need to be. Rest well. The ever-living fire will be here when you wake. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers along the ever-flowing river.